reductionistic, like the elements is reductionistic vis-a-vis qualities. So anything parsimonious is going to be reductionistic relative to the thing that makes it parsimonious.
Yeah, that's why it's the dominant.
Hello. Coming through. Testing, testing. All right, looks like I am coming through now. Going to do a little presentation here based on some questions I got the other day during a conversation that hopefully will get uploaded at some point. I mean, I can't see any reason why it wouldn't be uploaded unless, you know, it didn't go the way the host thought it would and thought that if they posted on their channel, they might not look so great. So anyway, we'll see. We'll see if that happens. Stay tuned. You can, you know, watch the space, my channel. I've got one of my playlists is my appearances on live streams, so you can check those out. And if it gets uploaded, I will include it in that list. And well, you can see what led to this this little yeah. Well, so let's see where I put that. All right, so I've got some pictures ready to go for the show. Just got to load up the. There we go. All right, so I just have to realign this quickly, so that it's legible. So it looks like the text is not particularly big here, but all of this can be found in the link below the stream, which I put it into a. Let's see here. Just move that. I put it into a ChatGPT format, which is pretty easy to read. As far as what that format is, it's I have to check it. All right, I'm not sure what format it is, but anyway, you can click that link and see it's an output from ChatGPT, and it's basically what I put into it, and then you can read that, and you know, hopefully also read what you know, you can read both. Read what I put into it and what ChatGPT put out. Like, I don't think it's exactly 100% accurate because some of this stuff is really using pretty specific meanings, which it can lose track of those at some stage. So preamble, what we're talking about here today is non-dualist philosophy, specifically justification. Like, you can think of the whole enterprise of non-dualist philosophy to basically be pretty much just about justification. So what does it mean to justify something? Well, before we can talk about that, we have to kind of go into how the system just looks at stuff in general. So the most important point to make is that perception is authoritative. And that means that we can't really get under our own perception. And when we try to do that, we kind of run into problems, which I'll get into later, what sorts of problems those are. So as epistemic agents, so now we're talking about not just being perceptual agents, but epistemic agents, i.e. we're looking for knowledge. And when we do that, we're doing it from the perspective of individual perception. And that means that it's the baseline perception plus the ego, which individuates this universal perception into a localization that you think of something along the lines of the cogito. And then rationality arises in that. Practical authority comes about by accessing relevant aspects of perception through individual perception. So basically circumventing the ego, which severely reduces the domain of information relative to that original perception. So everyone is doing this to some extent, but the ego will obscure most of it and it's not really philosophically useful. It's more useful on the level of emotional inclinations or aesthetic preferences. So perception, like, is the thing that'll tell you that you like chocolate cake, for example. So that's not philosophically relevant, but it's something we all have access to, and it's the style of knowing things in non-dualism. So it's a much more intimate way of knowing things, and rational facts are not really considered things that we can know. So we can know a language, but then the things in that language, we can memorize them, but that's not the same as knowing. Because just like back to the chocolate cake example, it's immediate. Knowing's immediate, so like you taste it and immediately like it. There's not some intermediate rational process that justifies whether you like it. So if you want to be in, accept my worldview and whatnot, there's a few. Hi, the trusty ape and purple Pippin. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions, feel free. Slightly off topic is okay. It would be good if it was, broadly in the topic of philosophy or my other subject of interest, consciousness, AI, whatnot. So as I mentioned already, perception's the ground of knowledge. That's utterly inescapable, and that's basically going to be a staple of any Eastern philosophy. Ahimsa is the ground of morality, same thing. Vibration is the ground of matter. So they express this in different ways. And they talk about things like ether, space, and so on and so forth. It's hard to translate a lot of those ideas, but basically you're looking at vibration as an irreducible process in matter. And then the interactions of that vibration is consciousness. And that's a procedural consciousness, which means it's non-localized. It's just happening everywhere. So vibrations everywhere, consciousness is everywhere, and then throughout that, you get these little pastiches of precipitations of appearances. Desire is the ground of mind. So if you go to simpler and simpler and simpler down to the quote axiom of the mind, you get something like desire. And then conversely, you can build up everything to current state of mind based on this singular axiom, which is, everything is a permutation of a desire. And that's not a bad thing. That's just a description of the state of affairs. And then once this state of affairs becomes basically unbearable, we also offer the option of enlightenment, where you end your suffering. And so and because it's so hard to reach this state, all of the definitions in philosophy are reverse engineered based on this eventual goal, which may seem like, oh, that's weird to sort of tie something in from religion to philosophy, but it actually ends up working really well, because the principle dictating philosophy is parsimony, which is what it shares with enlightenment, because enlightenment is parsimony with regards to your individual ego. It ends up also, if you implement it that way, providing a range of parsimonious models for physics. And I don't just mean boring old particle physics. I mean any physical system. So 6, another big one. And hi, Cafe, sorry, nice to see you. Acosmism, I'm not actually sure what that is. If that's like where the universe doesn't exist or what. I'll just wait for you to explain it, because I'm not sure, like the whole global existential non-realism thing, I don't go for that. Like, I take the fact of talk, if that's what you're saying, like I take the fact of perception to negate the absolute non-existence. But if I'll just wait and see if that's in fact what you're saying. So 6 is really important. The appearance of suffering is epistemically indistinguishable from the actuality of suffering. So eventually we want to end suffering. Therefore, whether it seems like I'm suffering or I'm actually suffering, to me, those are the same. So that's where they join up, and for all intents and purposes, yeah, they're the same. All right, so then it's best to reason on the basis of parsimonious knowledge technologies that assimilate data so as to optimally predict relevant future observations. So that's just a reassertion of how science should work. Doesn't always work that way, but there you have it. Philosophy reduces to epistemology, which reduces to metaphysics. So this is a little bit maybe confusing for a beginner. You can access metaphysics, like, so you can deduce metaphysics from epistemology. And then metaphysics kind of functions on its own. And then you can treat metaphysics like logic. And then even if you don't already have the epistemological aspect, epistemology aspects nailed, you can still apply the metaphysics as a logic and get in this why it's still applicable when you're not enlightened or not even seeking enlightenment. It's still very useful as a technology. Okay, so still haven't got to the questions, but I just wanted to give this overview before starting out. Again, there's one truth, it's absolute non-dualism. Because it can't be expressed in language, arguably that means there's zero truth. But then there's also a two truths doctrine where there's two kinds of truths, absolute and conventional truths. So the conventional truths would be coming out of the absolute truth, which is non-dualism. And they don't really work together. In some systems, they'll say, oh yeah, they work together because they're both illusions and like this co-arising thing. But I don't look at it that way. I think that's a bit confusing. So it's absolute non-dualism, and then there's an appearance of relative truths within the totality of absolute non-dualism. Civilizationally, we believe that there's a cycling that happens, so wax and wane towards and away from like an optimal state of knowledge relative to civilizational attainment. So there's no abstract own essence, like optimal knowledge state. It's always like the knowledge is optimized when it gets the most traction with a given civilization. And then gets the traction, civilization gets reformed. So it's like a resetting it to a good state. And then stuff gets confused, things are misunderstood, people get lazy, and then you get loss of knowledge, which then necessitates someone to take birth to reform it, and then it goes back to being perfected, and then begins the decay process again. So this, again, is not something we consider good or bad. It's just more or less a description. And then what would be bad would be to deny the description. Is this like, okay, well, this is how reality works. And if you're saying how reality works is wrong, you're making it harder for people to understand how reality works, making it harder for them to transcend reality, harder to achieve enlightenment, to be bad. Pervasiveness of knowledge of truth co-arises with normativity of authoritative edicts. So once something is authoritatively determined, and we'll get into what that is later, it's considered to be knowledge of the truth. So it is not true in the sentential sense. So it's not a proposition. It's an embodied state. So go out, do a debate, win the debate. You get to be the authority. What you say is considered most true. Aptitude to parsimoniously describe the state of affairs is gained through the embodiment of absolute non-dualism. So again, this goes back to our original definition of knowledge. It's that which is necessarily embodied. So you can know a language because it's necessarily embodied knowledge, because if you know how to read a language, you look at words on a page of that language, you can't not read them, which means it's necessarily embodied. So we want that eventually for enlightenment. A particular state of civilization evolves. I mentioned that, that's pretty obvious. Embodiment of optimizing the ability to parsimoniously describe the state of affairs also evolves. I missed a word there, but yeah, that's what it is. In short, truth doesn't change with the manner knowledge is derived, changes subtly in order to optimize civilizational traction. So a couple definitions. Think about a technology. It's an implementation of an authoritative methodology. So a technology is more than just a methodology. A technology is knowing how to implement a set of methodologies. And then the methodologies have a specific intention relative to each other. So it's like one level of abstraction past methodology, which is just like the scientific method, basically, hypothesis tested, Technology is more than that. So you can reduce it to that, but it's understood as something more complicated than that because it is a specific implementation of an authoritative methodology. So method is authoritative over result if the method reliably instantiates the result and if the method is parsimonious. So we have some result X that we want. And then a method would be authoritative over X if everybody who does X gets X. So let's say it's enlightenment, method is whatever enlightenment method. And then if you can say, well, it's reliable, we've got all these precedents where it works, so now it's authoritative. And it's authoritative because out of all the ways we could have done this, this is the simplest one. So people will tend to argue more about the second point. I was like, well, actually, mine was simpler than yours, but that's ultimately sort of a pointless discussion because there's something called biconditional indeterminacy that basically makes it impossible to know. So we'll get into that a little bit more later on. Just check these messages to make sure there's and nothing I miss. It's the term related to Aldous Huxley's The Mind at Large, or the reducing valve of consciousness. Non-dualism is also emphasized within the perennial philosophy. Yeah, I have that book. I've been trying to read it, but God, it is so hard to read and care about a book and like try to plod through all those words. And here's the thing. That's like I'm always in teacher mode, so I'm like thinking of correcting these mistakes. And it's like nobody cares about me correcting the errors in that book, so it's just kind of a waste. Yeah. So Kai-Fei, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, says it's an experiential truth. Yeah, that's one of the principles, is like it's not really knowledge of interest unless it's experiential, because there is like a utility to just a purely logical understanding, because you can memorize logic and then implement it, but that doesn't mean that you know it. So memorizing implementation stage is like an intermediary stage where you want the benefits, but you're not actually going for the full experience of knowledge yet, because you haven't committed yourself to a lifestyle of embodying knowledge. But yeah, I mean, it's the dissolution of the subject-object dichotomy. That's a very old idea that you can see that it'll come back even if it's not popular, like all the anti-realist stuff in modern philosophy. That's tilting towards non-dualism. It isn't itself non-dualism, but it's going in the direction of acknowledging what non-dualists have known for a long time, which is there's a limits to what we can know, and if we want to know as much as possible, we have to line that up. We have to line up what we can perceive with the best way to understand stuff, which is parsimony and subject-oriented understanding, which doesn't mean it's a subjectivism about truth. It just means that we incorporate subject explicitly into the model so that there's no ambiguity, like as to whether you're dealing with a subject or not, or as to whether you should expect a system to exhibit subjective behaviors, which isn't just purely reserved to biological organisms. So we also have this accounting for like why does that happen? Why do non-biological things behave as biological entities? Well, it's because everything, the universe is a mind, and all the appearances of the universe are just permutations and recombinants of this fundamental mind. So what's justification? Like, I worry about sometimes getting into these questions too much, because I don't want people to get the wrong idea that like I think it's proper to harangue people to justify their positions. Like, I think it's fine to debate, and as long as both parties are cool with it. But like, I don't think, like, if you want to be in this world view, like, it's important to have a certain live and let live philosophy where it's like we're trying to minimize harm. So, very rarely does that involve demanding somebody justify their personal opinion. We try to kind of remove that harshness or whatnot, and just say, let's just talk about what is less opinioned about what we're discussing here. So just put it in a purely logical, impersonal form, and then we're not saying the person is in themselves wrong. We're just saying, well, maybe their understanding is wrong, or something like that. I don't really get that upset when someone says I'm wrong, I guess because I'm not wrong that much, but it does really derail things when you don't have at least an intention towards decorum, because then people get offended, and then it's that sort of festers if there's no restitution for it. So don't want to get off on a tangent here, but just because this system justifies stuff amazingly accurately doesn't mean that now you can go and bother people with the fact that their opinions are self-refuting. So people are entitled to their aesthetic preferences, because we go against the principle of harm minimization to impose your aesthetic preferences on someone else, because who wants that? So if we're going to talk about justification, it's improper to do it unless we're talking about a knowledge technology. And personal opinions do not count as knowledge technologies. They might be related to a knowledge technology, but they aren't themselves knowledge technologies, except that trivially everything is a knowledge technology. So the word someone chooses tells you something about their state of mind. It's just trivial. So usually the trivial stuff, something we acknowledge in philosophy, we don't really care about that much. Care about non-trivial stuff, i.e., what is your opinion that you can say from an axiom, goes to this conclusion parsimoniously, and why should anyone care about your particular parsimonious version of whatever? So the belief is basically, no, we don't form opinion, we don't form cosmologies or worldviews or aesthetic preferences. We don't form those things rationally. It's pre-rational, not irrational. There's still some sort of biological logic operating, but we don't have access to it. It just sort of happens. And then that aesthetic preference reduces the range of possible aesthetic preferences that you could have into some sub-range. And then within that sub-range, a range of arguments justifying the aesthetic preference arise. So the first step is the aesthetic preference, then it's the argument. So it's considered a fallacy to target the arguments when what you're trying to do is change someone's mind, if that's what you're trying to do, which is probably not proper to do. So have a think about it before you try. But it would be a fallacy to even attempt to do that through an argument. Really, a debate is not an argument, sorry, a justification, which is what leads into a debate. That's something we would only care about for knowledge technology, because it's the only thing that's really relevant. What result that is actually knowledge can we verifiably get parsimoniously? All right, so non-dualist philosophies, one of the first benefits of it is, mostly when you're starting out, there's no reason that your worldview would itself be a parsimonious axiomatic inference model, unless some strange, unlikely circumstances, right? It's normally just a patchwork of impressions and random arguments that if you you could very easily find self-refuting causal currents within this patch, because it's a patchwork. It's not something that the person has insisted, okay, well, I'm not going to think anything until I can think through everything as a parsimonious axiomatic inference model, because who thinks of that other than me? So that's one benefit, is that you don't have to worry about your beliefs contradicting each other, because you can see where your beliefs contradict each other. Then you realize, oh, well, I don't want my beliefs to self-negate, so I'll figure out what's the actual, what was my non-self-negating attitude that got misrepresented as this self-negating quote belief, which is actually just an opinion, but which is actually just a patchwork of whatever stuff that most people just memorized as a single word, never thought about it again. It's kind of like, the way T-Jump looks at debating, like it's a video game where you have to get 50 coins or something before you can pass a level. So this approach is very useful for implementing philosophy to define beliefs as something that we don't have access to, and opinions as something that we do have rational access to. That's useful for psychology because we don't, we have no reason to believe that we have rational access to our beliefs if beliefs are the thing that predict behavior. Because maybe some people, some anecdotes, have such self-awareness that they can point to their motives and their underlying subconscious beliefs that dictate their behavior, but that's not most people. Most people could not draw a line between their subconscious inclinations and their philosophical opinions. So there is utility to this. It's also a bit of, kind of reminds you to be humble, like by prefacing everything as an opinion. Kind of makes it so that you, and maybe if it's absolutely true, you can't disagree in an absolute sense, but you can disagree in the sense that matters. And like, if it's an opinion, it's more of a take it or leave it thing. It's not an imperative or whatnot. This approach is, let's see here, so subtle differences of opinion just between experts regarding the absolute parsimonious philosophical basis. So this is interesting to me, but I don't go into it too much, but basically I can use this thing called biconditional indeterminacy to prove that you can't prove just on the face of it whether Buddhism or Hinduism is more parsimonious, because there's two components that are both contributing some amount of the opposite of parsimony, which is complexity. So if you want to see more of this, you can have a look at the link. So justification, how does that work? The justification that I usually do, because most people aren't non-dualist philosophers, are not going to talk about my context of knowledge necessarily. So it would just be a description, which is in itself going to be exceedingly controversial because it means that water's not wet. So if water is wet, then that's, quote, a contradiction, which is, I don't know, there's actually contradictions in the conventional sense, but the incompatibility, or what I call self-negation. So the premise that water is wet is self-negating because water is the cause and wetness is the effect. So anything that equates its cause to its effect is self-negating. So just saying that, try saying that to someone who's not initiated or whatever, it's not going to go good. Let's just say you want to be a bit diplomatic with this stuff because people have their existing beliefs and they're like, how could stuff be right that doesn't accord with my impressions? It's like, why would it? You're like a bug relative to the universe, so why would a bug know anything? So that's, doesn't really actually involve non-dualism. You could hypothetically do this yourself. You just have to really, really think through, causality. How can water be wet? Well, you have to think about empiricism. How is wetness determined in the first place? Well, it's determined because you can observe something that has water in it. We can't observe water in itself. We can observe what water does to an observation device. And that's going to be to make it wet in a great majority of cases. But you have to make that distinction. Otherwise, that little error, just presuming that water is wet, that little error is going to do it. Same with in math, by presupposing that lines are possible. That little error has huge, huge problems later on. It works in a narrow band, but then you try to generalize it, and then the farther you get from that band, the more wrong it is. So the next level would be asserting something in terms of the knowledge fork. So I technically did do that with the water is wet. I said, water is matter. So then I had to look at the boundary. So I looked at the boundary between water and wetness, and I was wondering if there was a boundary between water and wetness, and there's an observational boundary between water and wetness. So that means that they are metaphysically distinct, which means they are subject to the unilateral causal principle, which means that you can't equate one to the other because they are happening like the metaphysics is real in this case, so that they're happening in reality, and stuff never happens all at once. It's rendered at the speed of light. So even though that rendering is ultra fast, it's aggregate, so we do need to get it right. All right, so this is where basically where you would start for any kind of a justification is you're just centering it around its mind by finding its material boundary, and then plotting out the modifications of the material boundary as a function of the subject or some other variable that will reduce to a subject. So I showed how that works with the water and do a bunch of examples, but that's the basic idea is you have to take whatever it is you're looking at, establish its matter boundary, and then orient its quote mind, which is all these conditions in the matter fork, which we've got a bigger version of it up here. All right. So yeah, I appreciate everybody tuning in to the show. I hopefully got, yeah, thanks for the comments in the chat as well. Doing this one alone. So what I'm going to do is like, I'm just going to need like the odd break. So I'll leave this diagram on the screen and I'm going to play a little bit from a recent appearance that I did. And then I'll be back within a few minutes. Just want to get a drink so I can make sure that I can proceed as long as this takes.
Approach.
So I'll get my.
Definitely since Einstein, but even before him of the Neo-Kantians was a move towards pragmatism.
Yeah, so because pragmatism is so popular, I present my teachings in a pragmatic way. But if I were presenting them to a different audience, they'd still be pragmatic. They'd just be pragmatic for something that was not conventional. Whereas physics is relatively more conventional. Because it's like, well, yeah, well, maybe I can see that what happens in physics actually does affect my life. Whereas maybe the truths of religion affect my life. It's not self-evident. Maybe the truths of philosophy affect my life. But physics seems harder to dismiss.
Yeah, so pragmatism generally.
So just because I'm presenting this stuff as pragmatic doesn't mean the system itself is defined on a pragmatic basis. Just to make that important distinction, is defined on a parsimonious basis, of which one of the virtues is pragmatism.
Even though to some extent you can never escape definitional regresses, the pragmatism aims to avoid.
No, this is closed. There's no regress here because it's closed. Everything is contained here. There's no definitional regress. It's a finite number of definitions enclosing all the concepts that you need.
Yeah, but
so there's no regress here.
Any one of the concepts. And so the
I understand what definitional regress is, and that's why it's hard to make a metaphysical thesis, because you need to circumvent definitional regress while still maintaining a semblance of coherence, which is obviously really hard because you need to navigate the boundary between conventional and absolute truth.
Well, that's the other thing, that pragmatism aims to avoid definitional regresses and aims to avoid disputes over coherence. They say, well, even if it doesn't cohere, you're being pragmatic about it, that even if you could say, well, is it really coherent? Is there contradictions between terms? That the pragmatism is like, okay, we're going to move forward, even if there is incoherence and without precise definitions.
Hey, sorry.
You go ahead.
Just had to answer a question. Yeah, so that said, now I feel like I've been sort of circling this topic for a while. The domain restrictions, definitional modality, similar systems. So basically, I'm going to present like how to think about this stuff by giving a limited historical context at first, which starts here with the grammatical convention. So grammar is super important, and if you actually go to study the Vedas, a lot of it is grammar and pronunciation. So it's not just word order. Grammar has a much more general definition, just has to fundamentally do with intonation, what you mean when you say something. That's very important because part of the virtues of the system is that want to be able to speak in a way that conveys our truth. So how to think about definitions, as I was mentioning before, we think about, conventional language as something that is evolving and therefore doesn't have an absolute identity, because we can always have introduced neologisms, which may or may not have any correspondence to the extant word basis that we can establish on the face of it, right? Like a Kazorlak or whatever, just want to invent a word for the sake of proving that it can be done. We just sort of say that's fine, and we actually celebrate the plurality of conventional language because we think of it as like, if you're going to make a painting, do you want more or less colors? And you might not use, maybe the language has 50 gajillion shades of brown, and you're just like, well, I don't need to use all those colors, right? But in theory, it's good to have more options.
Yeah, and coining your own
However,
word avoids, because when you use the advantage of using other words that are similar, but you coin your own words to avoid, you say like, no, I mean my own thing. I mean something different than what you understand. Therefore, I'm creating my own lexicon.
well,
As
you
opposed
need
to,
to have, this is why you need the pre-existing knowledge basis, because you're calibrating conventional understanding using the existing knowledge basis into modified definitions. So if you look at these definitions and you think about them, you realize there's nothing about them that contradicts the conventional sense, but they are more than just the conventional sense. And that's what's another virtue of non-dualist philosophy, is that you don't have to lose the conventional sense of important concepts, which are called metaphysical or procedural primitives. So how to think about definitions is that in conventional language, we have basically infinite numbers, the number of definitions that we could possibly make. In philosophy, though, we want to restrict ourselves to the smallest possible number of definitions that still gives us the requisite amount of conceptual depth and coherence that is required. So that's why we have this knowledge fork that will work in anything that is empirical. That means anything that is based on perception, you can model this way. And not a lot, not everything is. I'd say, maybe most stuff is, but a lot of it isn't. This is still useful even when you're not modeling that way. Won't go into that right now, but at the very least, you can use that for conscious systems. Still going into grammar, I've talked about this a bit, just to distinguish like particular and proprietary sense is like basically every philosopher has a proprietary understanding of concepts, which leads to particular use of conventional words. So I'm saying like every philosopher should basically make this explicit. And if you don't understand language well enough to explain how your use departs from the conventional sense, you're not good enough at this stuff to actually write what you think down. Like, why should anyone care? Frankly, language is not that complicated, right? Language is over here. Physics is up here. This is the hardest part. So language is actually second easiest to behavior. So
Hi, I'm back now. Sorry about the wait. Appreciate everyone's patience. Hi, David. Nice to see you in the chat. Yeah, so that was me on my recent appearance on Duvid's channel, which is linked. I put it in the chat, but I'll also put it in the description later. And you can have a look at that at your leisure if you're interested. It didn't start out very well. Like, there's just some people I don't want to talk to them at all. Like, I talk to a lot of people and I don't want to waste my time with people that I just like, based on experience, don't feel that there's any point to talking, because like I basically said, probably more than I should have said to these people in the first place. And I'd rather just focus on important stuff. So then it gets into the interesting thing. So far what we've looked at is knowledge fork, and then orienting systems with the knowledge fork. and I'll do more examples as time goes on. The most interesting one is, well, one of the more interesting ones is chemistry. So you can derive chemical reactions using this model, and it's a lot of fun. So it does work for a lot of things. Probably a lot of information all at once, but the important thing to remember in the metaphysical diagram of the knowledge fork is that from the perspective of individual epistemology, you're starting out at perception. So we are subjects undergoing an irreducible process called perception. And when we go towards, so the eventual ending point of the subject when it goes through the linguistic pathway is towards the appearances of matter. So we've got individual perception, shared perception. Now, individual perception is the act of identifying something within perception. Doesn't matter what, just anything. Anything that individuates it to some type of an identity type of appearance is going to be an individuated perception. And then we have shared perception. So, this thing that we both sit on, and I'm going to say it's a chair, imagining way back in history. Oh, let's just call it a chair because we have that shared experience. And then more generally, behavior. And then finally, a type of behavior, which is language. And then tracing back to matter in the sense that matter is grounded in language vis-a-vis its concepts. Sorry, I meant to say, whatever I said, okay, excuse me. Language is grounded in matter. If I said that backwards, excuse me. So grounded in the sense that when you first learn language, you're identifying material objects, and you never really get out of materialism when you're dealing with language because there's always some initial relation to the initial process relation of learning that language, which was, your parent pointed at something and said, well, this is a bird. And then eventually said bird. And that would have been impossible without matter being grounded in language in this more abstract sense. So not in a metaphysics, it's not a metaphysical grounding. It is a dispositional grounding. So it appears to us that language is grounded by matter. Therefore, that's the case, but it's not a direct thing because if I can identify a bird with language, it doesn't speak anything to the essence of that bird. So that diagram is a parsimonious representation of knowledge, and it also has a parsimonious representation of the epistemic primitive, which is the most important thing. So if I look at a different philosophy, what I'm interested in is does the metaphysics have a parsimonious representation of the epistemic primitive? And if it doesn't, I can basically already conclude that it's just going to have too much friction within itself to actually have tangible results. So that's the epistemology. The sufficient conditions for epistemology are on the epistemic pathway, which is the vertical pathway from the mind into matter, to the appearance of a boundary, to the inner perspective of that boundary called a subject, to the irreducible process of that internal perspective, which is perception. And then from that, we have this abstraction of language that is differentiated from the purely epistemic practice through whether perception is individuated or not. So your bottleneck of ability in non-dualistic philosophy is always going to be how well you can differentiate individual perception from just general perception. And that's where most people get stuck understanding when I'm explaining to them. I'm going to tell them, the universe, the fundamental, let's say, consciousness is absolute or irreducible in the universe. And people take that to maybe think I mean like something that I don't, because they're maybe not understanding that it's all just coming back to this singular distinction that they're thinking that I'm associating what I'm saying with individual perception, but really I'm talking about general perception. of which individual perception is the type that we are. It's not what we're stuck with, but it's like the baseline. It's the egotistical mind. And in non-dualism, that's not a bad thing. The ego is not bad. It's just there. It's what animates everything. And so it's not bad. It's needed for motion, but it can have bad effects. So learn how to manage it. Whoops. Absolute justification. So, sorry, parsimonious justification. And this goes a bit beyond what I've talked about so far, but this already exists within non-dualism and stuff that I didn't come up with. So the 5 elements are parsimoniously justified when they're applied to properties. So you get 20 properties, or sorry, 20 qualities. You get properties, quality, maybe you can interchange them a little bit, but traditionally they're called qualities. So that's considered parsimonious. And so forth. So if I wanted to debate in a traditional orthodox way, I basically always have to be appealing to a parsimonious justification. And if I was going to introduce something new, because this is new, this is not standard parsimonious justification, I'd have to qualify it. I'd have to say like, oh, because there's no chance that the other models that are the traditional, which you might call a cosmology, I call it a metaphysical basis. So that's just my reference to here, the knowledge fork. Okay, yeah, maybe there's something, and I mean, I'll even grant that there is another one that's, if not more parsimonious than this one, and more general, so that there are like considerations of parsimony versus also the scope versus also the resolution. So I'd have to make an argument first that this is just as good as everything else. It's just good for this one application. So that in itself would be a huge endeavor. But if it was accepted, then it would be authoritative that anyone else could reason on that basis. But all of these parsimonious justifications in themselves, that's not really the point where you can debate like an actual champion. So yeah, you can debate within a field if you understand its parsimonious justification like really well, but what you really want is an absolute justification, which is like which parsimonious justification at any given point in the reasoning process and why. So it may make more sense to reason using, I know it probably sounds crazy to reason using the elements, but it does actually make sense sometimes. Like there's a very narrow range of problems where it makes sense. So that the next type of justification, absolute justification, that's yeah, sorry, I skipped a step. Absolute justification is just the combination of 3 and 2. So this would just be a limited number of premises associated with the knowledge fork and other systems that are traditionally validated as parsimonious. And what's validated is going to depend a little bit maybe on the school, but you'll see the similarities that there are these validated systems that apply slightly differently. Like there's more emphasis on the elements in the medical system. In pure logic, less emphasis on the elements unless the elements have metaphysical significance apart from pure biophysicality. Okay, so if you can get to this point 4, then you can move to the next stage 5, which is what I was, jumping ahead towards earlier, which is when you know which one and you argue for which order in which to apply these parsimonious justifications. So a lot of the times a single lens of justification is insufficient, like just establishing that a system has a boundary. In a lot of cases, if it's not a physical, like let's just say if it's not a purely physical system, it's not going to be telling me necessarily everything that I need to know. This isn't an explicit representation of properties, and properties are important. So that's where you have a debate where you say, well, here's my thought process, and I appeal to these absolute justifications in this order, and either yours is less parsimonious for this reason, or you don't have an alternative, something like that. And then finally you have a last kind of justification, which is where you're talking to someone who doesn't already agree with you. then in that case you're less trying to teach and more just trying to edge them towards some, a more complete understanding of what you're saying. Okay, so why is there not a universal language if I'm correct, says Daryl. Well, according to my tradition, there is. It's called Sanskrit, but I don't talk about that because I'm not really like sure that I can make my point to someone who doesn't already like more or less agree with me. So maybe it does follow. I mean, if it follows that there's universal, like it doesn't necessarily follow that there's a universal language, even based on what I'm saying, but that is part of what my view entails. So, you could say, well, there is, if there is this universal language because consciousness is absolute, well, to what degree do we have access to it? That's where you could kind of argue. It's funny that there's someone called Mark Passio in the chat. Like, I doubt this is really the real one, but thank you for coming by, Mark Passio and Jack's Law. So yeah, not really sure. I don't really see any questions. So if you want me to answer what you're saying, just please put a question mark, because I see there's a lot of the things I don't really know how to respond to. Okay, so yeah, so the two things you can really do when you're defending your views to someone who doesn't already agree with you is you can correct their misapprehensions or undermining the credibility of hostile opponents. So each kind of justification is like a puzzle piece. They're not really, and better not to think of one as better than the other, just think of them as different ranges of knowledge. Okay, so these are just answering questions that I was given, so I might be repeating myself a bit. What is truth? Absolute non-dualism is true, but truth is not language act, because language is a condition and non-dualism is unconditioned. Everything else appearing to be true is a conditional appearance arising within the absolutely unconditioned state. From the unconditioned state arises the absolutely conditioned state. So that's actually a thing in my worldview. So we've got non-dual and then still kind of non-dual, but with attributes. So this is the attributed like the causal diagram for the attributed non-duality, which I won't go into too much, but is discussed in more detail on the stream I linked earlier, and I'll talk about more in a future stream. But yeah, it's definitely not just a bunch of words that are probably too abstract for anyone not already in the system to just sort of take on faith. It's just meant to present it in a way that it's actually going to be usable. So we've got the absolutely conditioned state. Okay, so absolute conditioned state, that's an actual thing. It has something to do with this diagram. And then conditional appearances arise as a reduction or deviation of the absolutely conditioned state. So over here, we've got the quantum periodic table, and then we deviate from that. So we deviate by removing a bunch of the balls all the way down to just the elements of interest. And then you get your what appears to be a molecule, but which is actually just a rendering of this form. Doesn't mean it's not real. What's real just depends how we define real, right? So we're not going to talk about necessarily what's real all that much. We're going to talk about results. We're going to talk about parsimony and the associated logic. Excuse me. All right, so I want to give the examples of why other forms of reasoning don't actually get to verifiable results parsimoniously, because there's something called biconditional indeterminacy. So why empirical processes can't determine ontological reality, get a model for the simplest empirical process, then we say, well, if it's more complex than what we can solve, then every other empirical process which this is the simplest of them, is also going to be too complex for us to solve. So physics presupposes the measurement of amount. Measurement presupposes observation. Observation presupposes separation between an observer and observation. Separation between observer and observation is epistemic separation. By non-dualism, epistemic separation cannot be established. So we don't try to establish epistemic separation. We just say, okay, well, let's layer it in as into one continuous experience with levels of emergence. And that means like components that can subsist in the absence of the others, and use that as a causal model. Okay, so by non-dual, okay, so measurement presupposes that which cannot be established. That's the conclusion. Amounthood presupposes numbers. By phenomenology, the epistemic status of numbers can't be established. Amounthood presupposes that which can be established. Okay, so you have this that's what is the biconditional indeterminacy, is it's two sources of things that can't be established. So empirical processes predicated on two presuppositions that can't be established. Empirical processes can't determine ontological reality, because if it was based on one presupposition that could be established, then maybe you're talking. But two, forget about it. Utility of physics lies in establishing the intervals over which the measurement of amount is well defined. So that's just a recontextualization of physics. It's not, I'm going to presuppose the whole universe is subject to the measurement of amount. I'm just going to say, well, I'm going to define it in the ways epistemically humble, and just say, I can't really speak to what's outside of this range because physics only defines things in this range. All right, so every empirical process, I think I mentioned this before, all empirical processes fall to biconditional indeterminacy. That doesn't mean that they're useless. That just means that in terms of caring about them from a philosophical point of view, we just, there's limits to their own capacities internally to determine absolute ontology, aka they can't. And then from that, we conclude you're basically looking at like, oh, well, we can't get a bottom up. We can't understand things from a bottom up approach, because like even this super simple bottom up approach of of idealized, I don't mean it in a philosophical sense. I mean in the like, oh, it's so great. This ideal version of a physics experiment, even that fails to be something we could determine in theory. So from there we say, oh, well, actually, let's just ask God. And then God's like, be parsimonious. And so we're like, what does that mean, God? And then blah, 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 we get the knowledge for it. So that's how it works. We don't rely on empiricism for a metaphysical basis, because that's self-refuting. So we ask God, God tells us parsimonious, and then God gives us the parsimonious answer, and then we can apply it. And so there's already a precedent for this. This probably sounds weird to the Western audience, but there's already a precedent for this with Ayurveda, which was revealed by God in the form of Sri Dhanvantari, Dave. And you can look this up yourself. Like, I'm not saying anything that doesn't accord with traditional opinions. All right, so what makes things true? I will usually, like, because you see this very sort of proprietary maybe definition of truth, I will tend to call things true when they are unfalsifiable, and not in a bad sense. Unfalsifiable means can't be proven false. So if in general, your perceptions to yourself are definitionally authoritative. So just conventionally, if I was going to say something was true, that's what it means, is that it is testimony from an authoritative source. So if someone speaks in an honest way about their experience, and I can tell, like, that would be something I would say was like somehow might qualify as true. Being a little bit more careful when talking about absolute truths, because definitionally it's not something we can talk about in language. It's something we can point to as there, but not that can ever come into language without compression. So what makes things true? Well, it's their proximity to non-dualism. So something with very few presuppositions and a huge scope of applicability, more true. something with tiny, nothing, piddly scope of applicability, tons of axioms, less true. But if it's deriving ultimately from perception, it's not false in the sense that if we're defining true as just something that exists, every perception that occurs exists. So kind of have to remember that truth, existence, reality, those things are not independent, and that ultimately every word you've ever known is going to be something that limits you from the non-dualistic understanding. So the way to do it is let the words go, embrace the non-dualistic understanding with a simpler metaphysics, which is contemplating the knowledge for one step at a time and what they each mean. And then once you have that knowledge, coming back to language, because trying to figure out language in language, probably not going to work out so well. So just a basic idea of what makes things true. Analytic truths presuppose axioms. Axioms depend on perception. Extra perceptual facts cannot be verified. Any analytic truth is less true than a truth that doesn't presuppose axioms. So as long as they're not self-refuting, analytic truths are just sort of necessarily true. And it's like a coherentist, tautologist notion of truth. And that's because these things originate in perception. But it is less true in the sense that it doesn't mean that much. It's only true over the range of its very small result. So because it doesn't cover a big range, it's less true. And the total range is not dualism, but once you get the total range, you lose all the words to describe it because words reduce range. Apophatic descriptions may not presuppose axioms. Okay, so some apophatic descriptions definitely presuppose axioms, but they don't necessarily do so. So if you learn how grammar works, you can phrase what you're saying so as to minimize axioms. Well, that involves understanding what the axioms are. So the trick is to never embrace the axiom that language conveys meaning. It's better to think of language as conveying conventions. And those can be conventions, anything from a chair to even mating rituals. Like those are there's a degree to which those are conventions. So, it's basic idea is all these conventional truths can be understood in an absolute sense. And then their presuppositions are more obvious. So if you get rid of the ones that don't self-negate, you have this range of what you might call process relational, non-false premises, and then can work your way towards more parsimony from there and there on. So if you're just starting out, an analytic truth will presuppose axioms. If you want to study that more, just look at the axioms of a vector space or the Euclidean axioms. Mathematics has several axiomatic systems, and math presupposes those axioms to solve problems that wouldn't be solvable without those axioms, which means the truths of math are less true than those unqualified by axioms. But depending on how validated the axioms are, the truths, quote unquote, of mathematics might be quite true, but it turns out that they're not because the axioms of modern math are self-refuting. But that doesn't actually end up mattering because we're in an illusion reality. So just because an axiom is literally self-refuting doesn't actually make your system useless. So that's why we have to be so careful with this, because we could very easily fall into a trap of math seems right, therefore the universe is mathematical, when actually, that's a self-refuting concept. We relegate math to a useful technology with a well-defined result, not a ontological substance. And we understand such identifications to be erroneous. So apophatic descriptions may not presuppose axioms. Okay, so biconditional indeterminacy is apophatic. So why? It's because the conclusion is a negation. So the initial presuppositions were that physics is about measurement of amount. And then the conclusion was the negation of the possibility that we could determine ontology through this process. So the conclusion negates the initial presuppositions. So that's more true than an analytic truth, but it's still, we still wouldn't necessarily know how close it was to the absolute non-dualistic, ultimate non-dualistic reality, because there's always further you can go. When you get to the max that you can say in language, people go follow you to the max, and then you get bumped up through collective learning, and it's not the max anymore, and it just kind of keeps going. So yeah, I hopefully this has been helpful. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I think that's about all the questions. And hopefully that I can continue this discussion because it was really fun, and I'm just gonna keep working on my explanations. So yeah, thanks, and we'll see everyone